Good afternoon. I am Pastor Laura. Welcome to our weekly Advent Fireside devotion. We are doing this each week leading up to Christmas and then also the Monday after Christmas as we kind of think about what Advent means for us in our spiritual lives. How can we best prepare ourselves for Christmas? So, one thing I've been curious about the last couple months and just haven't taken the time to research is how churches in previous pandemics or epidemics dealt with it. So, what did pastors preach during those times? What did the people of the congregations do? How did churches handle previous pandemics? And I think it's really easy to think of ourselves in this like really novel situation, um, even though we know epidemics have always happened, that we actually live in an age when we are remarkably free of them. So I like these words from C.S. Lewis in 1948. And he wasn't writing about epidemics, but he was writing about living in an age with the atomic bomb. And he said, how are we to live in an atomic age? I am tempted to reply, why, as you would have lived in the 16th century when the plague visited London almost every year, or as you would have lived in the Viking age when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat any night, or as you are already living in an age of cancer, of syphilis, paralysis, air raids, railway accidents, motor accidents. In other words, let us not begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. I like that because it reminds me that this is not the first time we've gone through something like this. And I remember back when all of this started, back in Lent, and it seemed so new and scary. You know, we were that very first Sunday, we were huddling around the laptops and the radios. We had this makeshift film studio set up in the sanctuary. Each of us were in our own houses, but we were connected by our need to be together and to hear from God. And in some ways, that was a really beautiful time. Uh, and then you have all these months later, the pandemic has become so political. A lot of us don't agree on how churches or governments or businesses are handling things. We're getting impatient. Some of us are feeling desperate. A lot of us are feeling less connected because we're very, very sick of what we're going through. And yet, again, this is not the first time that the church or the people have been through a time such as this. And so I thought I'd go back into history and see how other churches, other pastors have dealt with and spoken about times of plague. Um, uh, and actually, the other thing I wanted to say, I'm reading The Coming Plague by Laurie Garrett. So she wrote that book about 30 years ago. And she actually says that plagues always become political, that there comes a point in almost every epidemic when the response becomes polarized, when everything gets political, when we get tied up in our beliefs and our hopes and fears about all kinds of other things, and we're just very split on how to handle things. So even that response is not new, and that actually gave me a lot of comfort to know that even the way this has become political is not a new response to epidemic. So how did Christians of past years handle plagues? I promise I will connect this to Advent. But from what I was able to find, there's been a few constants. So I looked at Bishop Cyprian writing during a 15-year smallpox epidemic in Rome in the 100s. So, just about 80 years after Jesus, 70 years or so, 80 years after Jesus lived and died. Um, 15 years of epidemic, and we think we're having a hard time with 9 months. 15 years. And then I looked at Martin Luther writing during a plague epidemic in Germany in 1527. And then I looked at a sermon by Pastor Francis Grimke in Washington, D.C. During the 1918 flu epidemic. So there's a couple common themes. The first theme I found was that the Christian responsibility during plague times is to care for the sick and the poor. And that's even more true than in regular times. So even more so than church attendance, even more so than regular church activities, even more so than in-person meetings, more than worshiping with enthusiastic singing, the measure of a church and of a Christian during epidemics is to care for the sick and the poor. So epidemic times are extraordinary times. So these are times when we might not be able to worship in the same space, but which is normally one of the primary responsibilities of a Christian is to participate in communal worship, and that is so important to our spiritual growth. But epidemic times are extraordinary times. These are different times. In each three of these different epidemics, I saw that these pastors were advocating that we take the spiritual strength that we've gained from years of worshiping together and pour that strength into caring for others. So we might not be able to come together in person for worship, but we have been given tools to worship God in whatever ways we're able. We have those tools. If you've been coming to communal worship, if you've been participating in Sunday school, if you've been doing those things all along, you have the tools to continue worshiping now, even if you can't come into the building. And the other thing is, we have been given spiritual strength for such a time as this. For such a time as this. So everyone from Bishop Cyprian in the 100s to Martin Luther in 1527 to Pastor Grimke in 1918 preached care for the sick, for the poor, for those most impacted by the plague. So in that first post-Jesus epidemic, back in Bishop Cyprian's time, it was the Christians who took care of their sick friends and their neighbors, and the non-Christians were the ones running away. And so these Christians were caring for their fellow Christians. They were caring for people who were not Christians. And the result of that was that many came to follow Jesus. That epidemic was a time of great increase in the Christian population because people saw that the Christians cared for their neighbors. That was also true during Martin Luther's time. And also for Pastor Grimke. All of them saw that if the church cared for the sick and the poor, the people in the community recognized that and were interested in Jesus. All three of them also emphasize that acceptable risk during an epidemic doesn't mean gathering in the same worship space. Acceptable risk during an epidemic means that those who are strong in spirit and in body are to help the poor and the sick to survive and to give them comfort when they're dying. And that those who are not strong in body and spirit are to offer support from afar, whether it's through prayer, always through prayer, and also through other resources that people are able to offer. So it's that care for the sick and the poor that becomes first and foremost during an epidemic. The other constant I saw in these three guys preaching during epidemics was that an epidemic is a time that searches our souls and reveals who we really are. So Bishop Cyprian wrote, how suitable, how necessary that this plague and pestilence searches out the justice of each and every one and examines the mind of the human race, whether the healthy care for the sick, whether relatives dutifully love kinsmen as they should, whether physicians do not desert the afflicted. So a lot of these guys were also writing about how God causes plagues for the purpose of searching our hearts. That is not part of United Methodist theology. We would say that that God did not cause the epidemic, but the epidemic can be an opportunity to search deeper into our souls and how we treat each other. If you fast forward to 1918, Bishop Grimke spoke about how the flu revealed and challenged racism. So Christians who believed that white people were better than black people had to re-examine that. That death comes to people with any color skin, that life-saving help comes from people with any color skin. And so all three of these guys, Cyprian, Luther, Grimke, said that plague is a time for self-examination. How do I live? How do I treat others? How do I respond to people I disagree with? Am I reconciled to people I'm at odds with? Am I reconciled with God? Am I oriented towards seeking the good of our neighbors, or do I find myself mainly concerned with my own comfort and normalcy? How do I respond to God? How do I respond to my neighbors? During an epidemic, that gets revealed. And so this is Advent. Here's the tie-in. This is Advent. This is a time of comfort, a time of remembering that God is with us. Advent, though, is also a time of challenge. Advent is a time when we examine ourselves. Advent is a time we remember that Mary sang that her son was going to bring change to society, that her son was going to lift up the poor and the lowly, and that things as usual were not going to continue, that society was going to change. And so Advent is a time when it's very, very appropriate to be asked to let go of our expectations, to be asked to look at our faith and say, is my faith strong enough to handle what I'm going through? What places in my faith in my life need to be re-examined? It's a time when it's appropriate to be asked to let go of our expectations for Christmas as usual. There was nothing usual about that first Christmas. If you go back into history, all the wars, the plagues, the pandemics, the upheaval that has happened through 2,000 years since Jesus' birth, there is very, very rarely been a usual Christmas. Christmas is almost never usual. And there's going to be nothing usual about this one. But the question I think I'm asking myself, and that I want to invite you to ask today is, does our faith depend on things being usual? Does my faith depend on being able to sing Silent Night by candlelight in the sanctuary? Or is my faith built on something much, much stronger? And whatever your answer to that question is, it's okay to be honest. If that's something that you feel like you need, that's okay. This is a time to examine, how can my faith be stronger? How can I lean on God for such a time as this? How can I focus on the good of my neighbors during a time of upheaval, of uncertainty, when I just want security for myself? This is the time to do that, and God supports us in that seeking, in that growing. And I believe that that our church has the strength to get through this time that is not as usual, because we follow a Savior who is not the usual thing at all. We follow a Savior who was born in a time that was not usual. We follow a Savior who gives us strength for extraordinary times. I will see you next week, and thank you for watching.